This lecture on the Black Death is part of a unit on disease, contagion, and public health measures from the 1300s to the 1900s. The next lecture will cover the Columbian Exchange and the spread of Old World diseases to the New World. The third section of this unit covers diseases such as cholera and the public health measures and sanitation movements to prevent the spread of these devastating epidemics in the cities. So there are two readings for the Black Death. One is by Benedict Dow, who's a Norwegian historian, called The Black Death, the Greatest Catastrophe Ever in History Today, from 2005. And the second is by Ewan Callaway, called The Black Death Decoded, from the science journal Nature. And it really explains how forensic archaeology and the analysis of the DNA in the bones and teeth of plague victims reveals the secrets of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. The panic wrought by the Black Death between 1347 and the early 1350s is really not that unfamiliar, in the sense that in today's heightened media age, we live in an era where we might have a hysteria or a panic over the spread of the Ebola virus. How deadly is it? How quickly will it spread from a place like Africa through health workers and aid workers to the First World, to Spain, to the US? And what do we mean when we say that there's an outbreak, when we talk about an epidemic or a pandemic? What happens when the disease or the virus becomes endemic? So when we talk about things like the Ebola virus or the SARS outbreak that hit Toronto and came from Hong Kong, an outbreak is specific to a place, whereas an epidemic is a high-intensity illness or disease that's present in a particular time and place, but it could affect the whole community. Whereas a pandemic, and that's what's always being raised as a fear in media, on television, on places like CNN or Fox or 24 hours kind of news cycles. A pandemic is a really high-intensity spread of disease. It's present at a very specific time, and it might affect a whole country or a continent, and then might go international. And today that means global. Whereas endemic is when a virus is of a low intensity, it's always present, and it's specific to a community. The historical interest in the Black Death and its spread was kind of revived in the 1980s, when the AIDS epidemic kind of cut across Africa and among the gay community in Europe and North America. There was a lot of fear and ignorance how it might spread within these communities, and could it spread beyond. Now, what happened in 14th century Europe to make the population susceptible to such a huge scale plague or pestilence? One thing we have to remember is that there was a lot of population pressure in Europe at this time because of the medieval warm period between 1000 and 1300 that we've just studied. There was a rise in population during these centuries. That meant also a rise in food prices, more people to get certain amounts of food. And in the early 1300s, if you remember, there's a climate change, there's a cooling trend, and the beginning of a mini ice age or the little ice age. And the first of these crises really begins with the famine in the 1310s, which is really sort of the start of the little ice age. So people who were young in the 1310s, 1315, 1317, might not have had the best nutritional start to life and would have been adults at the time when the Black Death began. So there was sort of a malnutrition and a low immunity, as well as a series of wars at that time. If we look at a map of the Black Death in the 14th century, we can really ask ourselves, how did it spread? What are the patterns? Well, it's probably no surprise that the disease arrived by sea. And this is really a pattern where you get the port cities of Italy are really at their most vulnerable, because they're at the center of the trade with the East through the Mediterranean Sea. So all the port cities, Genoa, Venice, Florence, all these cities, and of course the islands of Sicily, for example, at the very bottom of the boot, are susceptible to anything that comes in the cargo of ships, on the clothes of sailors and workers in the ports. Any little four-legged creatures that walk down the gangplanks. And so if we look at a map of the spread of the Black Death, we really see that it begins in the south in Italy and begins slowly, season by season, to spread to the north, eventually reaching even Scandinavia, but missing places like Iceland and Finland. And the other thing to ask ourselves really is, who are the victims of the Black Death? The profile is quite unexpected, because usually with a seasonal flu or another kind of illness, it's the very, very young, babies, children under 5, or the elderly who are struck by those kind of seasonal flus. But the plague affected healthy adults. It hit parents, mothers, and fathers as well as their children. So it hit a section of the population that wasn't as susceptible to illness. And it also affected the rich and the poor. It wasn't a disease just of the lowest classes and the struggling classes. The only exception to that is that those who are wealthier could flee to the countryside, or they could flee away from the kind of coming wave of plague and escape the cities and crowded areas and go to areas that were unaffected. But nevertheless, it did affect both kings and queens and the peasants. And it was a seasonal advance. And that's because it came in the spring. It might arrive and kind of build up to a crescendo in about the summer and then begin to die off in winter. And as we'll see, it's because of the two vectors, which are fleas that live on the black rat. And fleas need hot, moist conditions for their eggs. So places that were too cold or too dry were less susceptible. And authorities knew that these waves of plague or pestilence were coming. What happened to the populations in these areas? Well, in England, there was population growth for the 3 centuries of the medieval warm period. But then in the 1300s, once the famine struck, you begin to have a decline of population. So in 1300, they estimate that the population of England was between 4 and 5 million. By 1347, the kind of waves of Black Death, you get 3.7 million. By 1377, there are only 2.2 million is the estimate. In France, around 1328, the population was probably about 15 million, and that was a level of population that France did not recover until the mid-1500s. It took about 200 years for France to recover its population after its swath of Black Death came through. Across Germany, about 40,000 towns completely disappeared in the 1300s and 1400s from these waves of plague. So in your reading, you'll see that Benedictau estimates that 60% of the population died, and he argues that the population reduced in Europe from about 80 million to about 50 million. Hendrik Poignard, who's a geneticist and an evolutionary archaeologist, says between 50 million and 100 million died. So historians and researchers do not always agree on the exact numbers. No one's ever really going to know. We don't know population numbers exactly, except for cities in certain regions. We don't have whole national figures for this time in history. But the range of estimates is that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population died. And this is true that you have this initial wave of Black Death in the 1340s and 1350s. And then every generation, there's a reoccurrence. So you have, for example, the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 66, where many, many people die as well. The social effects of this cutting off a whole generation of people in the 1300s and into the 1400s means that people were quite free. There was suddenly a lot more land. Wages rose. You could actually migrate to the cities. You weren't tied to your lord or to the manor. For the people who actually survived this devastating loss of all of their family or town, there was actually a lot more mobility, a lot more freedom, and potentially a kind of consolidation of wealth in particular families. So what are the symptoms like of the plague? Now we're going to read several accounts of plague from Italy in the 1300s, and one of them is Boccaccio's Decameron. There will be others to compare to. And in that Decameron, almost like a novel or a series of short stories, and the way that it's set is that there's a group of sort of 10 people, and they know that the plague is coming, and so they're going to escape out of the city and find themselves in a safe place in the countryside, where they then sit around and drink and eat and sit by the fire and tell all of these stories while they hope they're not going to become sick. So Boccaccio's Decameron really explains the outbreak that occurred in Florence. In the year then of our Lord 1348, there happened at Florence, the finest city in all Italy, a most terrible plague, which, whether owing to the influence of the planets, or that it was sent from God as a just punishment for our sins, had broken out some years before in the Levant. By that he means the East, Middle East. And after passing from place to place and making incredible havoc all the way, had now reached the West. There, in spite of all the means that art and human foresight could suggest, such as keeping the city clear from filth, the exclusion of all suspected persons, and the publication of copious instructions for the preservation of health, and notwithstanding the manifold supplications offered to God in processions and otherwise, it began to show itself in the spring of the aforesaid year. There appeared certain tumors in the groin, or under the armpits, some as big as a small apple, others as an egg, and afterwards in purple spots in most parts of the body, in some cases large and but few in number, in others smaller and more numerous, both sorts the usual messengers of death. To the cure of this malady, neither medical knowledge nor the power of drugs was of any effect, whether because the disease was in its own nature mortal, or that the physicians, the number of whom, taking quacks and women pretenders into account, was grown very great, could form no just idea of the cause, nor consequently devise a true method of cure, whichever was the reason. Few escaped, but nearly all died the third day from the first appearance of the symptoms, some sooner, some later, without any fever or accessory symptoms. What gave the more virulence to this plague was that, by being communicated from the sick to the healthy, it spread daily, like fire when it comes in contact with large masses of combustibles. Nor was it caught only by conversing with or coming near the sick, but even by touching their clothes and anything that they before had touched. This is really a great account because it talks about the attempts, the public health measures that cities took to clear the city from filth, to exclude, to quarantine people, to exclude suspected persons. So really these Florentines, these Venetians, the Genoans, the Paduans, they're closing up their city gates and trying to prevent anyone unknown from coming in. They're praying to God. They're using processions. They are trying through physicians, whether they are quacks or not, to understand the development of the plague and the symptoms of the plague. So if we look at this costume of a physician from the 17th century, and this is a German engraving from 1656, it tells us a little bit about the medical understanding of disease at that time. If you look at the clothing of this doctor, perhaps it looks a little bit odd to us. We are used to seeing doctors wearing a mask, perhaps especially a surgeon wearing a mask, but not a beak. This clothing is meant to protect the physician from the odors and smells of the patients. And there's one reason for that is because it was thought that mal air, as in malaria or bad odor, was one of the causes of disease. And this is really an understanding that came from the classical era, that in each body there were 4 humors: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, or kind of mucus, and blood. And so say if you had too much black bile, that's what made you melancholic and depressive. And so you kind of needed to balance the humors again. And this is why physicians sometimes used bleeding as a healing technique. And this was a way to help purge the body, which was already trying to purge itself through sort of vomiting, coughing, diarrhea, what have you. And so this physician is really wearing this kind of protective clothing and a mask, and his costume is thick, rigid cloth, whether waxed or oiled, and that would prevent any odors from sticking to it. That was part of the protective clothing. And then that beak, inside that beak, you would have like spices and herbs, like a little bit of potpourri that would cover up the smell, prevent you from smelling the death and the dying. And it's also why people would burn a fire to cleanse the air, to purify the air. The idea that the disease is actually caused by a bacterium called Yersin pestis is not discovered until the 1890s, until a later outbreak. So there are 3 types of plague. The first one is the bubonic plague. It's kind of the classic style of plague that's spread through the bite of rat fleas or rodent fleas, and the blood full of bacteria that get regurgitated into a human bloodstream. When an infected flea bites a human, it's escaping its dying host, which was a rat, could be a mouse, could be a gerbil, could be a hamster, all those cute little furry things. So that's like the classic form of plague. And what would happen would be you would get a little spot, and it might have like a ring of dots around it, and that would be the area of infection. And then your closest lymph node would swell up like a lemon or an egg, as Boccaccio would say. And that was really the classic sign that, so this would take up to 6 days, and then usually the person, once those kind of things appeared, could die within 3 days. There's also a version called septicemic, and that's through blood. This is something that still happens today if you're a hunter. The most deadly kind of plague is the pneumonic plague that affects your chest, and it's really to do with the cough droplets, that anyone can expel the cough droplets and the plague bacteria into the air, and that really involves human to human contact. So often when historians discuss the bubonic plague, their big question is, where are the rats? Why do we not find dead rats in the thousands alongside the mass graves of human bodies? And this was really the question raised by David Herlihy in the 1980s and his colleague and successor, Samuel Cohen. What causes it? Maybe it was a form of a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola virus, or maybe it was anthrax. Europeans living in the 1300s and 1400s had very little understanding of the causes of the Black Death. So their public health measures were things like shutting the city gates, as I've mentioned, to prevent foreigners. And this was something that took place city by city. There really were very few national measures until the 1578 measures taken under Elizabeth I. They blamed the Jews and burned Jews to cleanse different cities. They blamed witches. They prayed to saints, such as Saint Rocco. They also quarantined whole areas of a city, or in the case of Venice, an island. They had pest houses, and they shut people up in their houses. They buried people in mass graves to limit their contact with the bodies. What has changed in the study of the Black Death in the last decade? That is really forensic archaeology. We're studying the bacterium Yersinia pestis, discovered at the end of the 1890s, and studying the bones and teeth found in these mass grave sites, and studying their patterns of death, looking at these bones and saying, who died in this epidemic? And what they're doing is they're isolating the DNA of the ancient pathogen. They've actually now done these studies for 3 outbreaks of the plague. The one that we're studying really today is the Black Death, and that really didn't end until the last major outbreak of it was in 1722 in the port city of Marseille in France on the Mediterranean. But there were 2 other major plagues, and it wasn't until the research into the DNA that historians were actually able to make a connection between what's called the plague of Justinian from the 500s AD until the 700s AD, and then with the turn of the century outbreak, 3rd pandemic if you like, that lasted from about 1855 with the last cases in 1959. But the most virulent patch of that 3rd pandemic was really at the end of the 1890s in China and Hong Kong, and then it spread across in the early 1900s to New Zealand, Australia, and into the US, into San Francisco by steamship. So it's really that 1894 Asian episode where the discovery of the bacteria will occur by two independent medical teams. So because of the outbreak of the plague coming through the port of San Francisco in the 1890s, the plague has become endemic, low intensity, always present in the United States. The Center for Disease Control, based in Atlanta, Georgia, and you can see how it is endemic, particularly in the west and the southwest of the United States. And again, this is in a table with the reported human plague cases between 1970 and 2012. And of course, the plague still occurs worldwide, so it is endemic in certain parts of the world. It's no longer an epidemic. So between 1900 and 2010, there have been 999 confirmed or probable human plague cases, and most of those have been the bubonic form. But most recently, I think quite remarkably, in 2012, a welder was feeding a stray cat out of his backyard, and he saw that the cat was choking on something. So he grabbed the cat, and then he tried to help the cat, and he ended up taking a mouse from the jaws of this choking cat at his home, and the cat, named Charlie, bit him. A few days later, he was feeling kind of feverish and not so great. He didn't, of course, have private health insurance either. Being the United States, he went to an emergency clinic, and the doctor sent him away. A few days later, he came back, and he had these huge lumps under his arm, big as a lemon. And right then, the doctor looked at him and thought, the plague. He was in intensive care for over a month. His hands turned black, as you can see, and he had to have some parts amputated. And this is one of the reasons why the plague, the bubonic plague, might be referred to as the Black Death, because it can cause gangrene or the death. You can see the blackening. Sometimes that also happens to the nose, but the blackening of the fingers and the toes. So they did remove his fingers, but he has his hands and he has part of his thumbs. They also removed his toes and part of his foot. They actually looked for rodents around his house. They dug up the cat, and it was certain that the cat was infected with bubonic plague. So just saying that it might be worthwhile making sure that you have a flea collar if you have cats or dogs, to make sure you have prevented them from getting fleas.